Ireland. I'm the transitional executive for the Synod of the Trinity, and it is amazing to have you all here. We are going to add the 7 or 8 minutes on to the end, so Graham has his full time because there's good stuff coming your way. Mike Givler is running communications and tech today. If you have a problem, please go into your chat function and send a message either to Mike or to everyone, and we will pick it up. Tonight's time you show by your signing up and being here is a really important one, as we have been through days that are unlike days that many of us have experienced. And our pastors are tired. Not that all of us aren't, but our pastors have been working harder than you can imagine, testing skills that they never used before, putting in hours that are different than they're used to. And we talked with Graham Standish about helping us to know how in this month of Pastor Appreciation Month, we might be able to find ways to help our pastors sustain, give them respite, be more aware of what's going on with them. So without further ado, I want to welcome you and invite you into the presence of one of our favorite leaders, Reverend Dr. Graham Standish, who is the Executive Director of the Samaritan Counseling Center. Counseling, guidance, consulting. He directs the Care for Clergy program, Care for Congregation program, and he works very much with pastors in one-on-one situations, as a spiritual director and as a clergy coach. Graham knows the topic. You will have time to talk to one another. You will have time to ask questions. We are recording this session, so you will be able to see it again. But Graham, if you would come on screen, thank you very much. How about I open us in prayer before we do that? Let us pray. Gracious and holy God, we give you thanks for all those who are gathered here and for the congregations that they represent. We thank you for the pastors that are serving in a time when there's more confusion than clarity. We thank you for gifts learned, for skills acquired, for energy of the Spirit that compels us on. We pray as he leads, and with those who are listening, may we learn and grow together in Christ's name. Amen.
Good. Well, thank you, Susan. I appreciate your welcome and everything like that. As Susan said, or hopefully you're all hearing me, I am Graham Standish. I have been a Presbyterian pastor for over 33 years. I am now the Executive Director of Samaritan Counseling, Guidance, and Consulting. And I'm going to share my screen a little bit so you're seeing information. So I'm going to flip back and forth between slides and me. But I am the Executive Director of Samaritan Counseling, Guidance, and Consulting. I've been the Executive Director there for 4 years. Prior to my becoming a pastor, I actually was a therapist. I worked for several years in a psychiatric hospital with adolescents and children. I also worked in drug and alcohol, and I worked as an individual, marital, and family therapist. And also, excuse me, during my ministry back in the early 1990s, as part of my PhD, I got a PhD in spiritual formation from Duquesne University and was trained both in spiritual direction and also in integrating spirituality into therapy. But my experience with pastors really began in the middle 90s as I began to do more and more spiritual direction. And as I became pastor of Calvin Presbyterian Church in Zelienople, Pennsylvania, I slowly, my work as a spiritual director, which was the church I was leading, was gracious in allowing me to also be a spiritual director. Back in the late 90s and early 2000s, I started having more and more clergy coming to me. Fewer laity, more and more clergy. And I really began to shift almost entirely to just working with clergy. And the thing I began to notice over time was that the pastors I was working with, even though they were coming to me with spiritual issues, I'm in this church, I'm doing the best I can. It doesn't seem like anything I'm doing is working. Where is God in the midst of this? I realized that a lot of the issues they were having, although they were saying they were spiritual in many ways, they were also very pragmatic. And so before I even knew there was a field of executive coaching or clergy coaching, I began to shift to do more and more clergy coaching, realizing that for some of the pastors, their lack of a sense of God wasn't just that they didn't have a sense of where God was, but it was they had developed bad habits in leading their churches, or at least ineffective habits in leading their churches. And I began to work with them on how to become better leaders, how to lead in a way that motivates people and brings people together in community, and really works in a way that helps them to create healthier churches. And so as I was pastor of Calvin Church, and it was a church that grew over my time there, and as I worked more and more with clergy, I began to feel more and more of a tug to be able to do more work with clergy. And about 4 years ago, I became executive director of Samaritan Counseling Guidance Consulting, which was one of the primary therapy places that I referred people to, both clergy and elsewhere. It is a fantastic place. It's based in Swickley, Pennsylvania, but we have satellites that stretch everywhere from Washington, PA, up to Erie, PA, and are in places like Whitehall, Pennsylvania, Upper St. Clair, Rochester, Beaver, Butler, Bakerstown, Zelienople, and Erie, and all sorts of places in between. But a large part of the reason why I was willing to go there was because they had a very small caring for clergy and congregations program. And I really wanted to develop a more robust program to help pastors. And so over the past 4 years, I've slowly been able to grow it. Right now, in my own personal work, I work with about 30 pastors at any one time. I would say about 2/3 are in the Western Pennsylvania area. The other third of the people I work with really stretch across the country. And I even have clients in Canada and Australia. As you can imagine, the Australia one takes a little bit of timing, because normally I meet with him at 5 o'clock in the evening, my time, and he's at 7 a.m. his time. But as a result of that, I have really had a wonderful gift and opportunity to be able to hear the stories and hear the struggles of pastors, not only pre-COVID, but also during COVID. And what I would call kind of this fuzzy time, this not quite post-COVID, and it's not quite in pandemic. The complaint I've been hearing recently is, I thought the pandemic was bad, but at least there was clarity during the pandemic. What's happening now is I don't necessarily know what's going on and what we should be doing. And as I've been telling the pastors right now, and I've been telling people in the workshops I do, the big problem we're having in our churches right now is not the pandemic. It's the polarization that has come into our culture that we Christians have replicated everywhere, where we are fighting about everything, certain that we are right about everything, and certain that everyone else is wrong about everything. And we're breaking apart communities. And it's putting a stress on pastors where, Susan and Mike, I'm pretty sure you see this across the Synod, but we've seen it locally in the presbyteries in the Pittsburgh area, where more and more pastors are not only looking to go to other churches, but a significant number are just walking away from ministry completely. They feel burned out, they feel tired, they feel unappreciated. And so really a lot of my work is helping them. I also do small groups. I do a group with 15 pastors from 5 different presbyteries that we meet once a week that's on leadership. And then I also consult with churches and do a lot of other work with them. And I do really want to say how grateful I am to Susan for really, and Mike for coming up with this idea of really working with laity to help you all get an inside look of what's going on, and then think about what can you do not only to appreciate your pastors during Pastor Appreciation Month, but to actually turn the next year and maybe the next 20 years into pastor appreciation years, so that you can help your churches move to a healthier place. So let me just tell you a little bit about the format. This is going to have 3 different parts. The first part is I'm going to tell you a little bit about what's going on with pastors, a little bit peeking behind the curtain, and seeing what's going on in pastors' lives that you don't actually see. Then I'm going to move into talking about what is causing the burnout, depression, anxiety, and despair that we are seeing so much more in pastors. And by the way, when I say that, it's not just me. We have a significant number of pastors who are now seeing our therapists at Samaritan, and we're not alone. Others in the area, in the Pittsburgh area, Anchor Point Counseling and also Pittsburgh Pastoral Institute are seeing a significant increase in pastors. So the one is peeking behind the curtain to help you understand what's going on with pastors. 2, to talk to you about what's contributing to their burnout, depression, anxiety, and despair. And then the final thing is to help to give you an idea of what you all can do to appreciate the pastors better and to create a healthier environment for them. What we'll be doing is I will be giving you a bit of content. And then after each section, we are going to break up into groups, and Mike Givler has already kind of figured out how the groups are going to go. So I'm going to present some stuff, and then I will ask you some questions to reflect on. It may require, I don't know if you're going to be able to see my screen during the time that you're in the groups, but may want to write these questions down when they show up. And we're going to ask you all to just discuss them. And when you come back, I'm going to ask for a few quick, what did you pick up? What did you discuss? And then we'll move on to the next section. And then the final part will be, you will be actually gathering together more as churches when possible, or in groupings of churches, so that you can actually think about what's concrete that you can do to help your pastors and to appreciate them more and show them that you appreciate them more. So hopefully all of that will make sense. I want to start by telling you a story. And the story is one that happened in my church about, I don't know how long ago it was. It happened in my church, a Calvin church, probably about 15 years ago. We had a member of the church came in, and she was younger and was talking to our secretary. And she made the comment to our secretary, because I wasn't in the office. And she said, well, that must be nice, not to have to be in your office during the day. Being a pastor, that's got to be one of the cushiest jobs ever. I mean, really, what do? They're there on Sundays, and they really don't do anything else during the week. And my secretary said, what do you mean? She goes, well, pastors, I mean, really, what else do they do? And so my secretary said she sat down with the member of the church, and she spent the next 20 minutes going through what I do in a typical week. And she said she was looking at the face of the member, going from kind of smiling to kind of gaping to open mouth staring. And at the end, the member said to our secretary, oh my gosh, why the heck would anybody want to be a pastor? And I think my secretary, according to her, gave the perfect response, said nobody in their right mind would ever be a pastor, but a significant number of people who are called do become pastors, not because they have a right mind, but because they have a right spirit. And I thought that was a wonderful response. Now, she may have worked on that response to clean it up by the time it got to me, but I thought that was just a wonderful statement about it. So here's what I want to do. I want to kind of ask this question of who really is qualified to be a pastor, because I want to share with you all of the qualifications that typically, when search committees are looking for pastors, these are the qualities that they are looking for right up until now. So if you think about it, who's qualified to be a pastor? Well, To really be a pastor, a really good pastor today, you need to be an introvert. And you also need to be an extrovert. And you also need to be incredibly sensitive to people's emotions. And at the same time, you have to be incredibly intellectual. But already you're starting to see some of the problems of being a pastor, because most of the criticisms we have of our pastors are, well, they're really good at talking to people and really good at being comfortable. But they're really not, their sermons aren't really very challenging, but they are really sensitive. Or it is, their sermons are really good, but if you ever really spent much time with them, it almost looks like they don't know how to talk with people. I wish our pastor was really much better at talking with people. And the problem is, we want our pastors to be both incredibly introverted and intellectual, and at the same time, extroverted and sensitive. We want our pastors to be thoughtful preachers who really spend a lot of time thinking about what they're going to preach. But at the same time, we want them to be charismatic worship leaders, because we look on TV and we see these people who can come in and command a room. We want them to be an inspirational CEO type who's able to oversee the organization and act like an executive. But at the same time, we want them to be a compassionate counselor, somebody who can sit in a room with you and understand your deepest problems and be able to offer the wisest advice. We want them to be great conceptual teachers who are able to take complex ideas and make them simple for us. And at the same time, and who can actually teach us and talk to us in ways that makes everything make sense. And we also want them to be sensitive group leaders who can sit back and not talk and facilitate all of us in talk. We really want them to be a caring pastoral visitor who's really at ease at coming and sitting with us for long periods of time and just understanding where we are, but also to be a compelling leader who's able to get people to move in directions they don't necessarily want to go. We want them to be a passionate missionary who's able to lead us to all sorts of mission in our local area, in our regional area, and even periodically take us to places like South America and Africa, or maybe Appalachia. And at the same time, we want these people to be passionate prayers, people who are able to sit with us and sit with others and pray with a passion that inspires us with God's presence. We want them to be a contemplative presence. We want them to be calm all the time, to be gentle all the time, and at the same time be a ministry coordinator who's able to figure out everything a church needs to do, how to get everything organized, and how to get people moving in the right direction and to actually take minutes. We want them to be a studious scholar who spend a lot of time reading the Bible, reading all sorts of commentaries and things like that. We want them to be a calming spiritual guide who understand deeply the spiritual life. We want them to be an effective evangelist who is able to reach out in the community and get all the young people and their families to come. And this is true because a lot of time when search committees search for pastors, they start saying, well, what we really need to do, and I'm being accurate here, but also facetious. This is not a belief I share. But a lot of times they will say, what we really need to do is to get a young pastor and his wife and their children to reach out to younger people. And we also want them to be inspiring speakers who can speak on any topic and keep us leaning forward the whole time. We want them to be a compelling visionary, also an effective fundraiser who gets people to give money. We want them to be a marketing expert who can actually help us market our church out into the community, whether it's through events or signage or Facebook or TikTok or Instagram. But we also want them to be a human resources expert who can help us figure out what to do with that really difficult staff member who's creating all sorts of trouble and won't quit their job. We also, during COVID, we have now asked our pastors to become digital ministry experts. In most of our churches, we have asked the pastor to be the one in charge of figuring out how to do the audio visual, how to record the services, how to stream them, how to make them look compelling. Even though they've not had training in it. At the same time, we want our pastors to have this great, incredible family life. And we also want these pastors to have a very balanced personal life. So as you're looking at all of that, my question to all of you is, why the heck would anybody want to be a pastor? I mean, let me ask you a question. Raise your hand, and the fact is I can't see most of you, so it doesn't really matter, but raise your hand if you've ever been in a career where you expect the CEO, the superintendent, the person in charge to have all of those skills. If you've worked as a teacher, who expects the superintendent to have all those? If you work in a corporation, it could be a very large corporation or it could be a local one. How many of you expect the CEO or vice presidents or presidents to have those kind of talents? We don't even expect our presidents of the United States to have those talents. For most of the talents a pastor is expected to have, with the federal government or the state governments, they hire all sorts of people. If you think about this, well, maybe Donald Trump did, but for the most part, most presidents, most governors, most mayors don't even send out their own tweets. They have like 3 or 4 younger people who do all of their tweets, all of their Facebooking, all of their recording, all of their digital stuff. And the question really becomes, who would want to be a pastor? And yet, if you look at that, all of those things I just said, the people who are pastoring your churches, they're not necessarily skilled in all those areas, but they have agreed to try to be skilled in all those areas. And quite frankly, in most churches, even though most members would say to a pastor, oh, you don't need to do that, we can find someone to do that. Most people who say that to a pastor don't do anything to go find somebody who can do that. And often when they find somebody to do whatever that is, that person doesn't usually stay committed. And I'll give a good example. A lot of times in churches, when they went into COVID, they said, well, we've got to start streaming and we start to get stuff on YouTube. Let's just find a young kid or someone in our congregation who can do this. Now, some of you may have actually found someone, but in most cases, the churches tried to find someone, they did, and that person never actually followed through. So what typically happened was it came back on the pastor. Basically, this is not a way of saying you're poor pastor or anything like that. It's just making you aware of the stuff you don't see, because most pastors don't whine about this stuff to you. Now, they do talk about this stuff to me because that's actually part of my role with them. And they do talk to therapists about this kind of stuff. But they understand that for most members of churches, if they complain too much about all this stuff, then what happens is the members start complaining about the pastor, complaining too much about all of these things. And so pastors have learned to keep it to themselves. And unfortunately, pastors are people who are very good at reaching out to others and helping them. They're not very good at reaching out themselves to get help for themselves. The thing that I think really is important to question is, are our pastors overbalanced? A lot of times our pastors right now often prioritize congregational expectations and demands over their own mental and spiritual health. And I would add physical health. A lot of pastors, and I don't mean this as a criticism, but a lot of pastors are not in good physical health. And a large part of it is that they are working on weekends. They are working in the evenings. I will tell you for myself, I spent 22 years having pretty much 1 day to 1.5 days off a week. I didn't complain about it because I also liked the flexibility that if I needed a morning or an afternoon to do something, I could. But I was at Calvin Church 2 out of 3 nights a week, and my family worked around that. And it wasn't until I went to Samaritan that I actually got 2 days off a week. And I can tell you, in my first year, I didn't know what to do with 2 straight days off. I drove myself crazy because I was so used to having to prepare a sermon on Saturday and work on Sunday. And that really my only day off was on Monday. Often pastors prioritize congregational expectations and demands over their own mental and spiritual health. And the question is, are these expectations those of the congregation or those of the pastors? Because quite frankly, most pastors, when they talk to me about it and I talk to them about getting more balance in their lives, they say, well, this is what the congregation expects of me. Now, I don't know that that's true, but a significant number of pastors are actually quite a bit afraid to start prioritizing their own mental and spiritual and physical health because they are worried that they're going to be criticized by their members for not being around the church enough, for not having enough open hours, for not being there. I always remember something a Lutheran pastor told me who came to me for coaching and spiritual direction a long time ago. He made the decision that he was going to go into the sanctuary and pray every Wednesday morning. And he was going to spend an hour there to do that. So he did. And one time when he was there, he'd been there for about 20 minutes. And the secretary came in and tapped on his shoulder. And he said, yeah. And she said, well, so-and-so is here and really wants to talk with you. And this pastor said, well, can you tell them to wait about 20 minutes? I'd like to finish praying before that happens, before I come and see him. She said, okay. 5 minutes later, she taps him on the back, on the thing and on his shoulder. And she says, he really says he needs to speak to you now. And he said, just tell him I'll be there in 10 minutes. And so he showed up in 10 minutes and this guy's face was red. And he started screaming at the pastor and said, your job is to be here when I need you. You can pray on your own damn time. And he said it shocked him. And that was part of what we are talking about is what do you do in the face of those kinds of expectations of the members? And the question is, are those the expectations of the congregation or of the pastors? Because a lot of times they aren't the expectations of the congregation, but the pastors think they are. And the other question is, are these demands real or imagined? I think a lot of pastors have a hard time because they don't have members in the church who are talking to them about getting more balance in their life and are willing to stand up for them if other people complain. And so a lot of pastors, for this lack of balance, the demands may be imagined, but quite often they are real. And it's something that congregations aren't always very good at, which is protecting pastors' times and expecting pastors to have a balanced life. During the pandemic, really, there have been 4 pandemic and polarization conversations I've ended up having with pastors. And I want to shift now to what's going on now that's specific to the pandemic, but does contribute to what's going on. The 4 responses are, the one is from pastors who've just said to me, I hate this. I hate everything that's going on. They'll say, this isn't what I signed up for, and it's making me hate ministry, and it's making me hate the church. And they're saying things like, I am failing. My congregation hates me. They are sabotaging me, and I am ineffective. And a significant number of pastors are talking about this with other pastors, basically saying, I have begun to hate everything that I am doing. There's another class of responses that are people who don't hate what's going, it hasn't risen to the level of hate, but have said, I am so frustrated. All they want to do is to go back to the way it was. But this is our opportunity to go forward. This is our opportunity to actually do the digital ministry we should have done before. But all they want to do is to go backwards to the pre-pandemic time. And no matter what I say, they don't realize we will start to shrink even faster if we don't have a digital footprint, because after the pandemic, more and more people are actually tuning in, not just members, but most visitors to churches right now are sampling churches digitally. And if you do not have a digital footprint, they're not going to come and visit you because the population has changed. For these pastors, they are saying, I am so disappointed in my church, and maybe I would be better off somewhere else. And for these pastors, a lot of them are starting to look at other churches. You may not even know they're doing it, but they're starting not only to look at other churches, but a significant number are talking about just leaving ministry. There are others who basically say to me, I feel stuck in the middle. Some of our members want to go back to normal. Others want to go forward. And whichever direction we go, I get blamed. If we are moving back to normal, the ones who want to go forward say, well, we're only going backwards because the pastor wants us to go backwards. And for those who want to go forward and are pushing the church do this, they're saying the ones who want to go back to normal are saying, well, the only reason we're trying to go forward in this way is because the pastor wants us to go there. And it's really interesting to hear pastors saying, and I don't even know that I have an opinion, but I'm getting blamed for whatever direction we go in. There are other pastors, and these are a rarity, but they're saying, is it okay if I'm kind of enjoying the pandemic or if I enjoyed it? Because the pandemic allowed me and the church to be creative in ways that we never were before. We got to create videos, and I got to do Bible studies that were more creative. And I started teaching classes, and I started doing Zoom groups, and we're reaching out to more people. And it's fun. Whereas before, any idea I had would get shot down. But now during the pandemic, I'm kind of enjoying this because I'm getting permission to be creative. I'm going to ask you to hold on to these, because when we go into discussion time in a few minutes, I'm going to have you really think about what's your pastor's experience been of your church. Is your pastor one who maybe, because they're not going to tell you how they're feeling. Are they somebody who is saying, I hate this because they feel like they're failing and that everybody hates them and they're ineffective? Are they just frustrated because they're trying to move the church forward, but people just want to go backwards? Are they feeling stuck in the middle, or are they enjoying the ability to be creative? So again, 3 areas of focus. I'm going to do a few more minutes of peeking behind the curtain. Then we're going to break into groups. And then when you come back, we're going to talk about the burnout, depression, anxiety, and despair that pastors are going through. Not all, but a significant number. And then finally, how to appreciate your pastor that leads to healthy pastoring and can actually restore not only your pastor, but your church. So one of the things I want you to be aware of is that right now, what's happening to a lot of pastors is that they are often stuck in a bind between what they love in ministry, what they've been trained for in ministry, and what they have to do. And they are not the same thing. What they love is what gives them a sense of meaning and purpose. Now, I want you right now, I'm going to have a stop for about 20, 30 seconds. And I want you to put your pastor in mind and get in your head, what about being a pastor do you think gives your pastor a sense of meaning and purpose? And it's different for every pastor. For some, it's preaching. For some, it's doing Bible studies. For some, it's leading the church and actually doing board meetings and other meetings. For some, it is visiting with people and praying. And for some, it's something else in the church. But I want you to get in your mind your pastor and just jot down in front of you, if you have paper and pencil or pen, and jot down what you think gives your pastor a sense of meaning from what you can witness. It's the thing that gives them a sense of joy. Hopefully you're able to come up with something. What they are trained for, these are the things that pastors do with a sense of confidence. It's not necessarily something that gives them a great sense of meaning and purpose, though. It may be, but they've all been trained to preach. And so they preach, relatively speaking, with a sense of confidence. They have been trained to understand and use the Book of Order. So with some relative sense, they're able to do the Book of Order and do things in a decent and very Presbyterian way. Most have been trained to do some level of teaching, Bible study or whatever, and most have been trained to do pastoral care. So I want you to sit and think, and if you can, jot down, what do you think from their seminary education and elsewhere have your pastors been trained to do? I'll add one other thing you may not think about. They've also been trained to think about the direction the church needs to move in, because they have done workshops and read books on the direction churches need to move in. That does not necessarily mean that they know how to get the churches to move in those directions, but they have been trained in it. So what do you think your pastors have been trained in? Final thing. What do your pastors have to do that drags them down and drains them of confidence? Not always drains them of confidence, but can sap it away. I can think of the one thing for a significant number, and I don't know if anybody has done a study, but I would say it's probably 70 to 80% of them feel drained and dragged down by having to do the digital ministry of the church. They know it needs to be done, but they haven't felt trained and able to do it. And when the pandemic started, often they had to figure out how to do things they had never done before, like figure out how to record a service on somebody's telephone and get it up onto YouTube or Facebook Live or something. Often they've had to do it themselves. And when Susan talked about the long hours that pastors are putting in, for a lot of them, putting together something digital has added 5 to 10 hours a week to their week that probably already was moving to 50 to 60 hours a week. I have been in groups with pastors who said that during the bulk of the pandemic for a whole year, they didn't take a day off over the course of the first 3 months, and hadn't gone on vacation or even taken a staycation almost during the whole time of the pandemic until people started getting vaccinated. And this past summer, a lot of them took their first vacations in almost 2 years. So what do you think they have to do? And I will tell you, some of the things for me, even this isn't related to the pandemic, but when I first came to Calvin Church, it was significantly smaller. We did not have much in the way of a custodial work, and we had a senior center. And one of the things that I had to do that I did not particularly like was after the senior center was done, often I had to come in and clean the bathrooms because a senior had pooped on the toilet and on the floor. And I would probably about once a month at least, if not more, I would have to do that. Or often I would be the one who would have to go and buy things for the church because the church couldn't afford them. And so whether it was cups or other things, I would have to do it. Now, we did build up the church, so I no longer had to clean poopy toilets or buy cups and coffee and other kinds of things. But when it was a smaller church, that was difficult. It didn't drag me down, but it kind of irritated me because I was okay with it to some level. But at the same time, it's kind of like, really, do I really have to do this? So what I'm going to do is I'm going to have you break up into groups, and we're going to take 10 to 15 minutes. We're going to take 10 minutes. And in your groups, you're probably not going to know most of the people in your group. You're going to be tempted to want to do introductions, but I don't think we have time other than maybe share what your name is and where your church is. But I want you to share your responses to the stuff that I've shared with you so far. And then also share to what extent do you think your own pastor, the bulk of what they're doing, is it what they love? Is it what they've been trained for? Or is it what they have to do? And I want you to share that with each other. So I will turn this over to Mike and let Mike start moving everybody into the different groups.
You should receive a notice about entering our room. Please do so.
So one of the things that I want to make you aware of, and when I say this, I do recognize I have a skewed population that I talk to, in a sense that often the pastors I'm talking to on a regular basis are the ones who are seeking help. At the same time, I am a pastor because where I work, Samaritan, our main offices are in Allegheny County. I recently moved my membership from Beaver Butler to Pittsburgh Presbytery. But in this area, I've also been in touch with a significant number of pastors in Shenango Presbytery, Washington Presbytery, Kiski Presbytery, Redstone Presbytery, and also to some extent, Lake Erie Presbytery. And really in the conversations that I've listened to and I've had, there are a significant number of pastors who are just burned out. Now, we use that phrase burned out a lot, and I don't know if people really know what that means. My basic shorthand definition, which is not only based on work I've done in studying burnout, but I went through my own period of burnout in my 20s after working in a psychiatric hospital with adolescents and children. I underwent a burnout that led me to be unemployed for about 16 months. And so from a personal level, I really get what burnout is. I think a lot of times we misunderstand burnout. Burnout does not come just because we are overtaxed. It doesn't come just because we are doing too much. And the answer to burnout isn't always take a break. I'm working with one pastor. And by the way, when I share stories about pastors, I am going to tell you that I'm giving you enough information to kind of get a sense that they're real people. But whenever I talk about pastors, I change significant things about them so that you will not be able to figure out who they are. Although for some of them, they're not even Presbyterian or in state. The pastors I work with aren't only Presbyterians. I work with Lutherans, Episcopalians, Anglicans, Disciples of Christ, Methodists, in other countries, United Church of Canada, Presbyterian Church of Canada, and also Mennonite. So I work with a wide range. Burnout does not come because I'm just doing too much. Burnout comes because I'm doing too much of things that now lack a sense of meaning and purpose for me. That sense of meaning, what meaning is this sense of what I'm doing. It gives me meaning because this is what I am alive for. This is why God created me. This is what gives me that sense of this is why I'm here. Most of us, if we are doing something that gives a great sense of meaning, we can work 50, 60, 70 hours a week and never feel tired or burned out, or rarely feel tired and burned out, because it's what gives us a sense of meaning. Purpose is what gives us a sense that we're making a difference in other people's lives. And when we have a great sense of meaning and purpose, it energizes us. It makes us feel like what we're doing is wonderful and we want to keep doing it. What's happened though now is a significant number of pastors are just burned out because not being connected with people, doing everything online, arguing over whether or not to wear masks or whether or not people should be vaccinated. It has robbed them of this sense that what I am doing is meaningful and what I'm doing has purpose. They feel like when they are in dysfunctional places where everybody just argues, it burns them out because they feel helpless to bring people together. What gives them a sense of meaning is the sense of community, is the sense of love that people share. And when it's not there, it leads them to burnout. For a lot of them, they feel depression. I have a client that I'm working with who's in another state. He is in a church that aggressively pursued him after he had been the pastor of another church for 25 years. It was a new church development that he took over 5 years in that was languishing, and he turned it into an incredibly thriving community where they had been meeting in a school and they had purchased property and built a $2.5 million building, all these kinds of things. Really, one of the pastors that I have a tremendous and significant respect for, he was aggressively pursued by a church that when he came, ended up really just attacking every idea he had, attacking everything he had. When there was conflict between him and a mentally unhealthy associate, in many cases, because the associate had been there for a while and had a history of dysfunction, they took the side, or maybe not took the side of the associate, but tolerated the associate and figured the pastor would just be able to deal with it. And recently, by his PCP, has been diagnosed with situational depression. And we are in the process now of him and me talking about what's his next step. Can he stay and reset the relationship now that the associate pastor has left, or does he need to leave? A significant number of pastors feel a sense of incredible anxiety. Like everything they do, they're on the verge of getting criticized and yelled at. I know personally, I've had a number of, I've been fortunate in my career to not have this happen very often, but at least once a year, I would get one phone call of somebody who is angry, who would tell me about how bad a pastor I was. And I still remember the one sermon I did on Easter that I thought was really creative and good, that I got the anonymous note afterwards telling me that my sermon on Easter ruined Easter for her and her whole family. Fortunately, because she had also written me a lot of other emails, by the way she wrote, I was able to figure out who it was. So I was able to put it in context. A lot of pastors are in a sense of despair, and it comes with a significant number of experience. For a lot of pastors, they are saying, I think this church might be better off without me. They're ambivalent about, they are saying about their church, our members are ambivalent and don't respond to what I offer, and it makes me feel useless. In particular, I think two pastors I can think of, one I'm going to call Natalie, who actually came to a church who said, oh yeah, we're very active in ministry and mission. We're a church that loves to do things, but we need someone who's going to come and help us take the next step. And she went to the church and was very excited. And they were very, very nice to her the whole time. But she said, they're just ambivalent. No matter what ideas that I come up with, nobody ever responds, even with, that's a great idea or that's the worst idea. It's like they just shrug their shoulders. And they just don't respond to anything I offer. And, it's like I come in to my office and I twiddle my thumbs. Sometimes I visit people, but I don't know what I should be doing, because we had a meeting about this and we talked about this. And when I asked them the question, what do they do best? They said, or when has this church been at its best in the past? They said, it's usually when we've not had a pastor. just think about it. If you're a pastor and they tell you that they've been at their best when they don't have one, how do you feel about that? Or I think of another one who basically has really tried to get them to be active in doing ministry, of reaching out, of giving, of trying new kinds of worship and things that they say they want to do, and just no one responds. And so for a lot of these pastors, it's they're better off without me. For others, it's they constantly resist me. They constantly find problems with all my ideas and are periodically harshly critical, both in person and anonymously. And there are a lot of pastors who they were told, we want you to come in and help us renew and, kind of move into the future. And once they've gotten there, any kind of ideas they've had, they're just criticized. I do remember one pastor who moved to a church from the Pittsburgh area to a church in Georgia. And after about 2 years, I asked him, I said, well, what's the difference between the church in Pittsburgh and the church in Georgia? And he said, when I was in Pittsburgh, I loved the congregation, but if I came up with an idea, they came up with 17 reasons why it won't work. He said, when I moved to Georgia, if I came up with an idea, they came up with 17 ways to make it work. And he said it just really was just very different. And I think there are a lot of pastors who are in anxiety and despair because they come up with ideas that they read about in books that they go to training for. And when they bring it to the church, often they will get criticized. And often they are criticized the most by what I call the most chronologically enhanced members of the church who aren't comfortable, say they want the church to grow, but really what they want is younger people to come to the church and love what these chronologically enhanced people love. When in fact, if you're going to grow a church, you're going to have to change to meet where those people are, because they're not going to love it. And when a pastor suggests, maybe we need to do something to up our childcare, a good response is not, hey, back in our day, kids used to sit in church and they liked it. It's not something that's going to help your church or the pastor. For others who are in much more dysfunctional churches, they will say, I'm in a clergy killer church. The pastor I mentioned a little while ago is like this. They are persistently critical of me. They tolerate dysfunction. They typically support the dysfunctional staffer and members over me. I have one pastor, I'm going to call Mary, who I worked with, who actually left a church, went to a church that had told her that we're a place on the precipice of growing and we're really, excited to have a new pastor. She was there for about 5 years and ended up in conflict with the music director. And there are a lot of pastors who are in conflict with music directors, and sometimes it's really the pastors. But in this situation, was working with a very temperamental music director. And when the music director really began to attack the pastor publicly, nobody stepped up to defend the pastor. And basically she said, I would be in meetings where she would attack me. And if I opened my mouth to defend myself, they would say, no, let her talk. But if she would try to defend herself, they would say, pastor, it's okay. It's okay. Let her talk, let the music director talk. And one of the things I often tell them is, many churches do take their pastor for granted, much like we do with our parents, because they look at pastors as being like mother and father figures who should be able to be criticized and get over it, who should be able to take criticism and figure out what to do to be better pastors, who should be able to do any of this stuff and be better. But they're taken for granted in the way we take our parents for granted. And what it does is it leaves pastors feeling isolated and alone. And often what happens is they expect the pastor to be the most mature person in the room. So if everybody else is dysfunctional, they do not tolerate it if the pastor is dysfunctional, but they do tolerate dysfunction from members, even in session meetings. They will not stand up and tell someone to quit acting like that, but they expect the pastor to do it and the pastor to tolerate it. Final thing is there are some who have gone through what's going on and they find their experience to be joyful. They find their congregation are open to ideas and new approaches, and they approach their church with joy, and it makes it easy to sustain a long and healthy pastorate. So I'm going to ask you to take 5 more minutes, maybe 6, 7 minutes, and I want you to reflect on your church. And since you're hopefully going to be in groups without other church members, maybe you can be honest and with some of these people who may be strangers and reflect on your church. Do you think your pastor is in church where it's easy for them to think the church would be better off without me? Are they in a church where the pastor might be thinking they constantly resist me? Are they in a clergy killer church? And the way you can tell this, if you go through a succession of pastor after pastor after pastor, there's a chance it may be a clergy killer church where in many ways the pastor is feeling like I'm being killed. Or are they in a joyful situation? And there are people like that. I will tell you, my 22 years at Calvin Church, with very few exceptions, were really joyful, and I really appreciated it. But that's a rarity. I think probably you find about 10% of pastors who really find it joyful. So what I'm going to do is to have you all break again into groups and kind of discuss with each other where you think your church is. Well, let's continue. We're on the final thing, and really, what I've kind of done is I've tried to give you a peek behind the curtain to see what a lot of pastors' lives are like. Because I'm going to go back on something that I've always believed in, and I'm like this as the executive director of Samaritan. I've always thought if I do my job really well, it should look like I have nothing to do. And what I mean by that is if we're organized, if we're operating in a really healthy way, if the staff has really healthy relationships, if we're really kind of prepared and doing that stuff, it should look easy, and it should look easy to other people. And, so it didn't bother me when the members said that I had the easiest job in the world, because to me, it felt like, okay, I'm doing a good job. But one of the things for a lot of pastors, the reason why it doesn't look like they have much of a job is because they actually do a really good job of making things look a lot easier and a lot simpler and a lot calmer than they actually are. Oh, by the way, I do need to do a shout out. Keith Langston, I have not seen you in 20 years. It is great to see you down there on the bottom of my screen.
Thanks, Graham. It's good to see you too.
It's absolutely fantastic to see you. So I'm really glad to see that. So what I want to do is I wanted to get you to peek behind the scenes, and then I wanted you to kind of hear a bit about what they're experiencing. I want to get you now thinking, and at the end of this, we're going to break up into groups that are more aligned with your churches. And then in the final, I think 3 or 4 minutes, I may take a couple of ideas that you generate from those groups. But what I want to do is to talk to you about how to appreciate your pastor, not just in Pastor Appreciation Month, but week to week, month to month, year to year, in a way that helps your pastor thrive, feel better about her or himself, and be better pastors. And I wish I could say this was all original ideas, because I really thought, like, how do I categorize what helps pastors feel appreciated? Because quite frankly, they're all different. I mean, pastors are like cats. They're not like dogs. They don't all respond in the same way. Or actually, maybe I should say some are cats, some are dogs, some are ferrets, some are, I don't know, bunnies, I don't know, whatever else you want to do. So I want to give you some different ways of appreciation. And I'm taking these ideas from, many of you probably have heard the book, The 5 Love Languages, it's a book by Dr. Gary Chapman. It came out maybe 20, 25 years ago. And I think it's a really good way. He wrote it for couples to help couples, because he recognized that how different people in a marriage, that some respond to acts of love, or love languages that are one way and their spouse is another way. And if I respond to things of love, if there's one way of doing it that I love, I might try to give that to my spouse, but it may not be what says to my spouse is loving. The 5 love languages are words of affirmation, quality time spent with each other, receiving gifts, physical touch, and acts of service. And so what I've done is I've co-opted these 5 as a way of maybe helping you try to figure out which one of these is the one that your pastor responds the most to, and will help them feel loved and cared about, and actually help them in their ministry. Some pastors need words of affirmation. With these kinds of pastors, their primary love language, where they feel fulfilled the most, is when others show their appreciation for them through compliments and words of encouragement, which can include simple notes, handwritten letters, personal phone calls, as well as official encouragement from boards, committees, and groups. I will tell you personally, this is not my love language. I'm actually always really uncomfortable. I on one hand, yeah, I like to be praised, but to me, I feel more embarrassed when people kind of praise me. I've always appreciated the fact that around Christmas time and all, that people would send me notes saying how much they appreciated me. I had one member of Calvin Church, God bless him, because he's just such a wonderful guy. He called me up 3 times a year. He would just call me up out of the blue in the morning, and he would always, the secretary would say, Jeff is on the phone, wants to speak to you. And I would kind of go, wonder what's going on with Jeff. And he would say, hey, I got the big guy. I'm so glad I got the big guy. I just wanted to tell you, I was thinking about you today, and I wanted to tell you how much I just appreciate you and appreciate all you do. And I know you work really hard, and you don't hear this enough, but we all really appreciate it. And I will tell you, I did appreciate it when he did it. I felt really profoundly uncomfortable, because for whatever reason, I've never been really particularly good. It's mainly probably because growing up, I got criticized a lot. I did not get praised a whole lot. So for me, when I do get praised, it's kind of like, what's going on? There's something going on here. But this isn't my love language. For some pastors, words of affirmation are like oxygen. And it is really important to do not only coordinated efforts, but also spontaneous efforts. And I don't know how you tell whether your pastor responds to words of affirmation, but one way you can tell is if you walk into the pastor's study or office and you see notes and pictures and other things that come from members or little tokens. That's pretty much affirmation that they appreciate words of affirmation. I will say something that is words of affirmation that I did really love. And Denis, I know you were part of this way back when, but when I left Calvin Church, a lot of people wrote notes to me about my pastoring at Calvin Church. And that meant a lot to me, mainly because it wasn't people coming up to me and saying how much they appreciated me, although a lot of people did, but it was stuff that I could read and kind of cherish afterwards that I didn't feel embarrassed about. So that's one way of love language. And I think it's paying attention. By the way, something I'm just going to say at the end, wherever your pastor is, if you can incorporate all 5 of these things, it's actually really good. For other pastors, it's quality time, that it is time spent with pastors and in the church. These are pastors who feel fulfilled in activities that center around togetherness. It's about sharing time with undivided attention. They respond best to members who engage with them in Bible studies, in small groups, in community activities, in ministry, in mission efforts, in meetings. I mean, I know pastors who actually like spending quality time with people, and they may frustrate members because they're like, this pastor could meet for 5 hours. Well, part of it is because that's probably the pastor's love language. They like spending time with members. They like visiting members. They like groups. They like church dinners. They like things where people spend time with each other. They don't necessarily need words of affirmation, but for these pastors, the pandemic has been explicitly a struggle, because these are the people who want to meet together, who want to have activities and dinners, who want to visit people in hospitals and talk with families. And for them, the pandemic really robbed them of quality time. And these are the ones who often feel useless, have felt the most useless during the pandemic. Others like receiving gifts. And they will appreciate small gifts. When I say gifts, I don't mean like, they need you to, buy dinner for them at Hyde Park or the best steak restaurant in the area. The gifts can be really small things. It can be, I was in a toy store with my daughter, and I came across this little, I don't know what it is. It's a little, doggy. And I thought about you and about, to me, you're always the person who loves us. And so I decided I really wanted to give somebody, give you a little puppy that you can hug too. It doesn't have to be something big. It can be a cross that you saw in a store. It's not the gifts they want so much. It's that the gifts represent love and admiration. It can be misconstrued as though the pastor is fixated on things versus love itself. And I will tell you, pastors' compensation can be part of this. That when a pastor is paid well, that's a gift. But when they're in a situation where their salary is constantly being cut, or where things are being taken away, it can feel like I'm not loved at all. Again, trinkets, the gifts can be trinkets: a stone found on a walk, a cross found in an outdoor market. It can include paying for a family getaway, or giving a beach house that you own or that you do a timeshare on as a week-long gift for a vacation. But for these pastors, for me, again, little small things that are funny, I've always appreciated, but I've always, again, felt uncomfortable with receiving gifts, but it's the way I am. I tend to be more of a helper. I'm one of those pastors that I've had to really discipline myself to find people that I can talk to about what's going on in my life, because I tend to be much better at wanting to help people than having people help me. Two more. Another love language is physical touch. These are people who prefer physical expressions of love over all others. They tend to approach ministry in a more intimate way, which can feel dicey in our modern professional and pandemic mindset. For them, being appreciated means being appropriately hugged. I am not talking about anything sexual or inappropriate, but appropriately hugged and touched. It includes physical gestures such as eye contact, smiles, undivided attention. This is my love language. For me, if people are coming through the line and hugging me, after worship service, that's really all I need. If someone's coming up to me and just, wants to talk to me and just puts a gentle hand on my shoulder, that for me is great. I don't need, anything inappropriate. And I, certainly don't gravitate towards the inappropriate, but that tends to be my love language, is something that feels a little bit more intimate and can be physical. And, for me, it's at the end of a group. And again, the pandemic has taken that away. It's also me moving to Samaritan as executive director has been taken away because we're in a counseling agency. You can't hug anybody. So when I go to churches or when I'm around, like if I preach back at my old church, Calvin Church, There's lots of hugs, and that sustains me for another 6 months. But for me also, we would close worship with everybody holding hands, or we would close groups or meetings with people holding hands and praying. And that for me was something that felt like love. For others, it is acts of service. With pastors who are like this, they appreciate offers to help or to make the pastor's job and life easier. It means helping in small things, recognizing when the pastor is overwhelmed and offering to shoulder a burden or a chore, encouraging the pastor to take a break and to find more balance, taking over tasks and chores the pastor finds unfulfilling. I probably would have enjoyed it if somebody would have come in and said, hey, I'll take over cleaning the toilets. But I was okay with that, actually. That was okay. I don't know, that last sentence was one that, because I co-opted this from another talk I gave to couples, you can see that I kept in the part about giving your partner, doing what your partner wants to do on the next trip together, how much sugar your partner adds to the morning coffee, what time your partner's favorite show is on TV, taking notes if you can't remember, blah, blah, blah. Clearly, I should have cut that line out because that doesn't apply to pastors. But at any rate, this gives you kind of an idea of a way of thinking about where your pastors are in terms of what helps them to feel loved and what you can do. Most pastors don't even know what their own love language is, so it's really hard to figure out what it is. But what I am going to do is we're going to have you break up now into groups. We're going to take about 5 minutes because this is stuff that you as a church can then take over on your way out. But I want you to kind of talk and share what you think your pastor's love language is, and just think of some real quick ideas of things you could do to help them feel better. And by the way, part of it's just maybe trial and error. You may not know what they appreciate until you try one of them, and then you see how they respond. So we're going to break you up for 5 minutes into groups and then come back for a final goodbye. Because we're kind of overtime or on the virtual overtime, I was going to get some suggestions from you all of what you suggested, but what I'm really going to do is encourage you, whatever you started in your small group, I would like you to take back into your church and to begin sort of looking at ideas at what you can do. As a close, though, I do want to respond. I got a couple messages that were just to me, and so I'm not going to share any information that were in the messages and the comments. But they are things that I had wanted to address and I had just forgotten. I got one message from somebody who said that they are friends with a pastor who's in the I hate my job category, and is basically kind of asking, suggesting, talking, what do I do, because the church can tell that the pastor is hating the job, and I think the person isn't sure what to do. One of the things that I really would encourage you to do is if you have a sense that the pastor is in a situation where I really do hate my job, I think it is really important for you or someone in your congregation who they trust to have a conversation with them about finding someone they can talk to. If they're in the Western Pennsylvania, I certainly would suggest Samaritan. But I also would suggest Anchor Point Counseling, which is another counseling center. By the way, at Samaritan, we do virtual counseling, so anybody in the state of Pennsylvania can work with our therapists. But I would get them to find someone to talk to, because often the pastors who really hate everything, they may be venting to a lot of people, but venting is not the same as doing something about it. And unfortunately, when we vent too much about something, it can actually make things worse. Most people don't know this, but those suffering with trauma, if they end up venting too much about the trauma without actually working with someone who can help them overcome it, it can actually make the trauma worse because it imprints the memory and it imprints the trauma on them. So I would encourage you, if you have that person's, that pastor's ear, to be somebody who will listen to them, who will care for them, but also will really encourage them. Find somebody who can help, who you can talk to, whether it is a spiritual director, a coach, or a therapist, who can help you sort through it and figure it out. And maybe also encourage the person to think about taking a sabbatical if that's a potential issue. And that brings me to the second thing, which is another person asked the question and said, our presbytery has been encouraging us to give our pastors more time off. And so we have given our pastor many more weeks off than they even normally would get in vacation. How much more are we supposed to give? I will tell you, I work with quite a number of pastors who have been on medical leave or have come back from lengthy vacations, and the vacations have helped. But when they've showed up back at the church, they feel burned out and exhausted again. And the reason why is that it's not just, there are issues that cannot be solved by taking time off. If they are in a dysfunctional situation and they're coming back to dysfunction, it's kind of like a separation in a marriage. You can go on separate vacations to, one to a ski resort, the other to a Florida spa. But if you're coming back to the same crappy marriage, you're going to feel burned out and exhausted. One of the things that I have really encouraged churches to do, and I have encouraged pastors to do, and I'm going to put this as sort of my last comment to all of you, which is some way you can show your pastor appreciation is to sit down with your pastor and look at their position description and ask the question, what can we take off your plate so you can get to do the things you love? So for example, if you've got a pastor who maybe is more introverted and not as good at pastoral care, can you find a way to organize a pastoral care committee in your church where the laity are willing to do more of the pastoral care? Here's the problem. The members are going to say, I don't want the members of the church to visit. I want the pastor to visit. And you as a church need to stand up and say, yes, I understand that, but we're going to be your visitor and we're going to let the pastor come in when there's a crisis or a real significant problem. If the pastor has no choice but to do more of the digital ministry, because the pastor is the one who doesn't particularly like it, but is the one most responsible for it, then figure out what other things can they take off their plates so that they have more balance in their lives. The key thing is, if you go back to that first slide I showed with all the things they're doing, when they are burned out, it is because they are unbalanced. And you can give them more vacations, but the problem is they're doing too much of the stuff that drains them and not enough of the stuff that feeds them. And what you want to do as a session, a personnel committee, an ad hoc committee, a team, whatever, is to sit down and ask the pastor, what feeds you and what can we do to take off your shoulders the stuff that drains you? And I am going to say one last thing about this. If your answer is, let's get rid of all digital because you hate it, you can do that, but you're going to hurt your church. Because churches right now that are getting rid of digital are actually signing their own death certificate. Because the churches right now that are getting rid of digital are hastening their own decline. Because all those people you want to come and join your church, they are now sampling your church online. And if you do not have an online presence, they're not coming to your church. So those are my last thoughts to that. I will say I am really hopeful that out of this, that you've been given a really good peek behind the lives of your pastors. I hope that you've been given a really good sense of what's going on, but also I'm hoping that you've been given a sense of how you can show your pastors that you actually do care about them and you do love them. And those love languages, I think, are really important, because if pastors feel loved, if they feel really loved where they are, they'll actually, it can soothe burnout. It can soothe being overburdened. And I will tell you, I do work with pastors and I talk to them a lot about get back to the things that feed you, get back to the things you love, and work with your church to help them to appreciate the stuff you love and to find ways to support you in the other stuff. So I just mixed two messages there, but I guess I was going back to what I was saying before. So that's all I have for you folks. I really, really appreciate both the time. You can see this is stuff that I'm passionate about. It's clearly stuff that Susan and Mike are passionate about because they put this together. And I'm really grateful that they have done this and that you all have taken the time to be part of this. So thank all of you so much. And I don't know, Susan, if you want to close us with a prayer so we can send everybody off in a blessing because they're leaving quickly anyway. And you're muted.
Yep, let's close. Friends, thank you for this time. Help us to keep thinking about ways that we can be supportive of ministry and our pastors as we continue to think about supporting one another. Thank you for Graham and for his gifts shared so generously. In Christ's name we pray. Amen. Blessings.
Amen. Thank you all.
Have a great evening.